It's a pleasure to speak on this, and I commend the bill to the House.
The Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Speaker, as my colleague David Parker has said, Labor will support the bill. We, like most other parties in the Parliament, believe in the worth of international institutions, the IMF and World Bank and WTO, ILO, others, being critical now in a globalised community and globalised economies. I just want to touch on a couple of things, and I note Mr Macleay's final comments about we should pass this in a timely fashion, and I agree, but I would just make this point. The question arises, why has it taken so long for this bill to appear in the Parliament? The advice I have is Australia passed equivalent legislation in September 2009 and November 2010. And this is just, I think, another example of where the government has to get its priorities right. This is a very important piece of legislation. Our involvement in the IMF, especially in the global financial crisis, is critical. We have responsibilities and obligations. And I would have thought that this piece of legislation, given its importance, would have been brought to this Parliament in due time. But putting that aside, our involvement in the IMF is critical. I remember a former Cabinet Minister in the 1984 Labor government made a point to me many years later, reflecting on the history of the turbulent economic times that were inherited in 1984, when a then Prime Minister, sir, who I'm sure you know of, refused to deregulate, and we lost $600 million, I think, in those days offshore. And the former Cabinet Minister said to me, the Labor Minister said, had we not been an English-speaking country back then, the IMF would have moved in and said she's all over, because we were, I believe, at that stage 6 days or 7 days, quite literally, from going broke as a country. That's how bad it was. And then if you look fast forward to the various economic meltdowns that we've had in various countries around the world, and now the GFC, you can see the worth of these global institutions. Unlike the financial crises of the 1920s, 1930s, where governments, heads of central banks, such that they were, politicians and critical institutions did not communicate, people acted and countries acted almost in silos. Now we have a situation where ministers of finance, central bankers, global institutions like the IMF and World Bank act in concert to try and stabilise the world economy, to assist those in greatest need, so that you don't get into a situation, touch wood as we go through this, where the world economy implodes to the extent that it's almost unrecoverable. This is an important piece of legislation. It will require, it will maintain, if you like, New Zealand's quota commitment to the IMF to around $3 billion. The former amount was about 2.9, so it's basically a steady state. But I think my colleague David Parker, in respect of the changes to allow future updates to the articles to be made by regulation, makes a valid point. When we have had major agreements in the trade area, for instance, they are generally brought back to this Parliament, and they are examined, and they're examined at select committees, and they are looked at quite carefully, because that is the appropriate thing to do. And to date, generally, at least within the major political parties, there's been a bipartisan approach to that reflects our joint view on New Zealand's interests. But I think it is, and that process is valid for a number of reasons. It's democratically valid, but also it allows folk in the community to have their say on those agreements, but it also allows, and I think this is a good thing, for various myths, especially in the free trade area, for instance, those who sort of linger in the shadows and create myths about what may be positive or negative about free trade. It strips that away, because it allows public scrutiny, not only of the agreements, but also of those myths and legends. Where we have difficulty, I think, in the communities is when there is a vacuum, and when things pop out of nowhere, especially with international obligations such as this, and when there is not appropriate scrutiny by the Parliament and thereby the community. Now, I just say to the Minister of Finance as he's going through and considering this piece of legislation, that it may well, and I don't make a political point, but it may well be worth reconsidering the mechanism by which those future updates are made, in terms of whether it is as proposed in here by regulation that can happen at the snap of the finger at an order in council, or whether it would be profitable to bring those back at least in a cursory way to the Parliament, thereby providing scrutiny of the Parliament and thereby providing to some extent a level. I see Mr Hayes shaking his head. I'm not sure whether he's shaking his head at you, sir, or me, or whatever, or whether he's just got the shakes. It may have been a hard night. But whether it would be worth bringing back those regulations to the Parliament to allow parliamentary scrutiny and to allow the community, even in a cursory way, to have some input, thereby providing some confidence with those who may have concerns about the nature of global institutions, and also exposing those who create myth and legend about them. Because sunlight, as they say, is the best disinfectant. So I say to the Minister of Finance, it may well be that he may wish to look at the mechanism again. I think it is also appropriate that when we are signing up to obligations like this, it is appropriate that the Parliament at least gets to scrutinise those, not after the event, but as they go through. And again, I think that provides some confidence, at least as people can say that the representatives of this House have given it the once-over, but also, if necessary, to question and inquire as to why, if there are questions, the government has signed up to regulations and supported regulations as they are. The IMF is often criticised, of course, for getting there, a day late and a dollar short, as someone once said. But one has to ask, especially in the GFC that we currently go through, what would have been the nature and impact of events had the IMF and other global institutions not been there. One has to ask that, and I think any student of history would argue that these are extremely necessary institutions. Now, New Zealand's contribution, and of course New Zealand's votes, are pretty minimal on this, and there are some, I've heard even some of the folks in my patch have said, why do we bother contributing to this? What's in it for us? Well, what was in it for us, if you go back to '84, was some serious support, but also we have an international obligation to do our bit, to assist others, to contribute to those international institutions like the IMF, and so in turn the IMF can play a role, as it has done in Greece and Portugal and other economies as they wobble around. Because of course what happens in Europe, what happens in Asia, what happens to economies when they are destabilised by whatever force economically, is that ultimately for a small economy, country and community like ourselves, that has a knock-on effect. We know that if China's growth rate dips, if for instance it was to go to 7% rather than 8%, that will have a knock-on effect to Australia, that will have an economic impact ultimately on us. We are a price taker. We sort of have to ride the wave of economic instability, and we have very, very little international influence in terms of that. So we support this piece of legislation. It is important. There is very little politics in this. But I just conclude, sir, by going back to my former point and that of David Parker's, that I would ask the Minister, as he moves this through the process, to consider the appropriateness of simply regulating commitments and changes and amendments to IMF agreements without due parliamentary scrutiny. And again, because there's very little politics in this, I reiterate the point. Where there is some parliamentary scrutiny and some community input, that in itself creates a degree of confidence, and that in those agreements, and that in itself acts as a barrier to those who would nefariously create myth and legend around those organisations and be nefarious in their motives. It exposes the arguments and it allows us to have a debate. It would be rather unthinkable, I think, if this Parliament did not support its Minister of Finance in supporting those amendments. But I think that, unless they did something completely crazy, I think it is appropriate that there is a level of parliamentary scrutiny, sir.
Call Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak